Everyone, and welcome to our, what is this, the 7th installment of Crop Diagnostic School this summer for July 20th. I can't quite get my head around how we are at this point in July just yet. But as always, we have our fearless leaders, panelists here to answer whatever questions that you happen to have. And feel like posing to our panel about some of the things that you're seeing in the field right now. So as usual, we have Dennis Lang, who is here to speak to pulses. We have Dave Kaminsky on the line here to speak about diseases, John Hurd for soil fertility. Ray-Jean Picard is joining us today as a substitute for Anne again. I know he's been on with us a couple of weeks ago, and so he'll be answering your cereals questions. We have John Gavlowski on the line as well for your insect questions, and Kim Brown to answer your weed questions. So Ray-Jean, while you're on, because while we were getting going and as people start having questions, again, feel free to post them either to the question or the tabs bar, or the question or chat tab. But Ray-Jean, when we were chatting, getting going, you mentioned something about seeing a few fall rye fields coming off, and since you're here to talk about cereals, what are you seeing so far with regards to yield?
Actually, I haven't seen a rye field harvested yet in the region in my area. I've been monitoring a few fields. They look okay. It'd be nice to know to see what really happens when the combines rolls through, but I think the June rains we've had, at least in central region, the western part, mostly, I think it seemed to be able to recharge the soil, subsoil moisture enough so that those crops that were just at that point of elongating and going into the reproductive stage were able to have that soil moisture to carry through. And like I say, some of the fields I've seen, and the ones that I've seen are the ones that have been kept. Some of them have been terminated earlier this spring because they were not good enough to keep. They suffered. They winter conditions were difficult, so many of them were terminated. But the ones that have been kept there, to my perspective, look pretty decent, I would say.
Yeah, I think we're all going to be very curious to see what yields are going to look like for a lot of different crops. And it's true that timely rain in June may have actually benefited for some of those winter cereal crops, which is good to hear. And again, we'll see what that looks like as we start seeing the combines roll. Keeping on, again, an annual theme of dry conditions. Dennis, a question for you with regards to soybeans. How critical is it right now that we're to see rainfall if we're currently, say, in about an R4 stage?
Well, with soybeans, the highest demand for water in soybeans starts at flower initiation, which is R1, and goes all the way out to R6, which is pod fill. Typically, if you're in that R3 or R4 stage, we're going to start to see the pod development. Now is the time that we need some rain. I was doing a little research on this, and there's a really good article on, if anybody's interested, on the MPS2 website, actually, and they've actually talked about this a bit more. But just to give you an idea, during August, during pod formation and seed fill, soybeans use about 6 to 8 millimeters of water per day. So, we're getting to that stage now, especially beginning of August. We're going to hit R5 pod formation. Any rainfall we get is going to be a benefit. So now is the time for that yield to be set right now. So.
Can you translate for John Hurd how many inches that was?
That's a 1/4 inch to 1/3 of an inch of water per day.
All right, there you go. I know, John. Yes, you're welcome, John. I know immediately you're going to want to know if you could have that translated so you can understand that number.
I was prepared for that one, so.
Well, and we often, around this time of year, John, and you might want to comment on this too, we've talked a few years ago at Crop Diagnostic School, we actually talked about water uptake by different crops. And a lot of the crops, as they were getting to kind of that full flowering stage, were taking, what, about 1/3 of an inch of water a day? Was that not the requirement?
That's been kind of at the top end that we look at. And some of that was done, Martin Entz, in some of his years, 20 years ago at the University of Manitoba, had a lot of students working on some of this. and the water use, and found that, interestingly enough, kind of across the board, a lot of crops will use up to a maximum of about 1/3 of an inch of water a day when they're full canopied and transpiring. And really, the reason some crops use more water than others is simply the duration of period that they're growing. A crop like wheat seems to use less than soybeans or corn simply because its lifespan is less. When they're full canopied, it seems that most crops are using similar amounts. When there isn't the water available, that's when we see crops wilt up. Soybeans flip their leaves, corn wilts, and others. So they're using less than 1/3 of an inch of water now, just because that ain't there in all cases. But under ideal conditions, that's what they would be trying to use to transpire, especially during these really hot days. Transpiring helps cool the plant down, enables air exchange, carbon dioxide in, oxygen out, etc. So having that water is important and optimum. And plants are just, as we see right now, they're toughing it out best they can.
Yeah, I would add just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dennis.
I say it'll be really interesting to see, what soybean yields are going to be like at the end of the day, because they talk about, soybeans requiring 16 to 20 inches over the entire growing season. And that will depend upon maturity groups and that type of thing. But that's a lot of rainfall. That's for those that are in the metric, that's 400 to 500 millimeters per growing season. So it'll be really interesting to see how these things, how they're gonna, if this rainfall that we get in the next couple of weeks, which I'm keeping my fingers crossed is going to happen, how it's going to really affect the yield. So.
Yeah, and I mean, John prompted me a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the same thing, because it's been a theme this year, to pull my master's thesis off my shelf and dust it off a little bit to look at water uptake, which is one of the things that I had looked at in canola. And I was just wanting to verify what I remembered from back then, which was that the biggest kind of bulk of water uptake that I saw in the water usage that I was doing was in the 2 to 3 foot mark at that kind of 50% flowering or mid-flowering part of the season in canola. So the water uptake is happening on some of these crops from deeper in that soil, but you can get through a big soybean crop to feed it to all of that moisture, even if you don't have the rainfall, when we have that subsoil moisture coming from the years prior. But it's not something we have right now, and so that's another thing to kind of be concerned about, because we just don't have that water supply power from deep down that we've had in the past. John heard, keeping on things that have been kind of showing up in higher kind of amounts, let's say this year, potassium deficiency, still seeing potassium deficiency in corn. How badly is this going to affect my yield?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if it will impact the yield or just be perceived as another symptom of drought, because part of what, if we have good potassium levels in plants, it helps the plants regulate water flow, chiefly by allowing the stomata to close up and prevent the hemorrhaging or loss of water when the plant doesn't have it. So potassium is important for water regulations in the plant. I don't have good data on that, and I've looked for that before. Sometimes it can be subtle. We talk about potassium deficiency being a hidden hunger, and what that tells us is that when we see deficiencies in the field, there probably is real hurt. There can be reductions in yield even without field symptoms. So when I'm seeing symptoms in corn, like the bottom leaves firing on the edges, if we see that in soybeans, then we're likely to see yield depression. But in a year like this, I expect that it's largely in conjunction with dry conditions, and the drought will get blamed rather than potassium. Just encourage people to do soil testing. our guidelines for potassium are pretty rigorous for a crop like corn. For corn and potatoes, we have set 200 parts per million as the critical level, and that's almost double that of other crops. So if you're growing corn, you've got to be serious about potassium. The other crops can tolerate somewhat lower levels in the soil.
So a question about, again, dry conditions.
Did we lose your audio, Marla?
Sorry, I think I double tapped. Sorry, I should be better at the mute button by now, but I thought I muted myself, but I muted it again right away. Never hover your finger over the button is my lesson today. Okay, so Rajon, back to you.
Donald Trump took them away from the button.
With dry conditions right now that we're seeing, is nitrate accumulation going to be an issue with cereal grains? And if so, is there a certain part of the plant that it may accumulate? And John might add to this a bit too, potentially.
Yes, nitrate will accumulate. I guess John just talked about moisture utilization by the plant. And so in a year like this, when we have high temperatures, very poor moisture to begin for the plant to be able to utilize, the plant that's still surviving with what's there is not able to use the resources effectively, specifically nitrate, as it's coming in with the water that it's taking up from the soil. So even though the plant might be evaporating some of the moisture to maintain some of its living needs, I guess, but it's not able to utilize the nitrate, which is normally a component of plant tissue and so on. So it's accumulating, and it would typically accumulate mostly in the lower part of the plant and gradually higher up on the plant. Now, that's not an issue for crop producers necessarily. Like nitrate does not accumulate in the grain itself. It's starches and proteins, so nitrate itself does not accumulate in the grain. So it's not an issue for crop producers, but for anybody else that may be using other parts of the plant, like for straw utilization, certainly there can be some residual nitrogen or nitrate accumulated in the plant. And if it's going to be used for livestock as part of the ration, that's something to be watching for, and it can be tested. The local public-facing offices, ag offices, have testing kit. It's a color testing kit. We can verify the presence of nitrate. We cannot tell how much. So to tell how much is present in the plant, in that plant tissue, it has to be sampled properly and sent to a lab for an analysis. And then once we have that, then we can determine how much is there, and then it can be used then to determine what proportion can be used in an animal's ration.
Okay, I was going to add to that, but I mean, I figured you probably go in that direction anyway. But in areas where people may be considering, depending on what's happening with kind of crop yields and stuff like that, in areas where people may be looking at cutting crops for green feed as opposed to like harvesting them for livestock, as opposed to actually, combining them. That might be something that we need to think about, and that testing can be done. If there are high nitrates, then I assume that you then are trying to say mix that when feeding with something that has lower nitrate in order to kind of lower those levels, or is there, what's that management that gets done at that level then?
Yeah, a feed that has nitrate, yeah, a good point with, it's not just in straw, but people that have already maybe harvested some green feed would also be wise to test for along with doing a proper complete feed analysis for energy, protein, and minerals, but also for nitrate test, which is only an extra $10 to $20 for the analysis itself. And so yes, every mouthful that, let's say, a ruminant would take in from this product has to be blended down, depending on the amount of nitrate in the feed or the straw, whatever. It has to be blended down below a certain level so that it's safe all the time. So it's not something that the animal, there can be some adaptation to it, but again, generally speaking, we say the ration, every mouthful the animal takes in has to be blended down to below that level in the whole ration.
Okay, maybe not something that all the crop people want to have to think about, but it is something that we do need to be aware of, especially in a year like this year, where there's always that chance that, or there's a very high probability that a good portion of the crop itself, whether it's actually the entire crop, grain 2 taken for green feed, or the straw itself is going to be fed this year, just based on the conditions that we're in. I just want to add to that you can also call the ARD toll-free line if you're wondering where you can take your samples to, so what offices or places you can take your samples to. So that number is 1-844-769-6224. I will post that into the chat as well in case anybody has any questions regarding where they can take their cereal samples to. John Hurd, so back to nutrient deficiencies, which seems to be a theme of the year. And again, we've talked about this before, that a lot of it might be due to kind of just dry condition in general, but seeing discolored soybean leaves on dry, sandy, high pH soils, typically in the higher kind of part of a landscape, let's say. Is this possibly iron or manganese deficiency? Like, what could be going on? I've done tissue testing and it's showing that things seem to be sufficient, but I expected that there might be some kind of deficiency going on that's causing those leaves to kind of burn off or crisp up around the edges or turn yellow.
Yeah, thanks, Marla. Yeah, there's been a number of agronomists that have turned in what they thought were strange results to me from a tissue or soil test, saying that, you know, we've got this, what visually appears to be some nutrient deficiencies in plants, and the soil test is coming back saying that there's sufficient nutrients in the soil, and the tissue test showing similar, that there's sufficient nutrition in the plant. Doing field investigations, we find that that soil test is actually pretty important. A lot of these things seem to be landscape related, and when we look at the soil test, this ends up not being my problem, but more Kim Brown's problem in the weeds department, in that these higher landscape areas tend to be lower organic matter and often much higher pH. And I think we're still seeing, due to the dry weather, some hangover from previous crop herbicide residues. Normal year they would break down in these cases, but not this year. So that soil test is still very important. It's a kind of eliminating crop nutrition as an issue. And if you tease the information from off there, particularly pH and organic matter, I think it's pointing us more towards herbicide residues. But I'm going to kick this over to Kim to tell me, to let us know what she's seeing and in the field, and what else we should be looking for.
Yeah, thanks, John. And those are really great points. I know a lot of times people, the first thing they think of is a nutrient deficiency, because there's a lot of look-alike symptoms, especially with this particular thing we're seeing. Like, we're seeing a lot of flucarbazone residue, which is Everest and Sierra. We're finding that that if you actually look at the label, which is in the guide, or a copy of the labels in the Guide to Crop Protection, and there needs to be certain conditions met if you're going to follow peas or soybeans after Everest or Sierra. Particularly peas this year seems to be a real issue, and we've seen it on some faba beans as well. And again, it's a high pH. You need to have a minimum moisture. It needs to be minimum 4 inches, but it should be it should meet the 10-year average for precipitation, which we didn't have last year. And some conditions that aren't going to change year by year are those landscape parameters, like that high pH, that low organic matter that's on those tops of the hills, that type of thing. So, and some of the symptoms that we see when we're seeing a herbicide residue, in this case, it's a yellowing of the growing point's a bit yellowed. It does look like a manganese deficiency, possibly a potassium deficiency. So we're seeing some of that, but also within the rows, it's not even. You can have a couple of rows that look not bad, and then you have a row right next to them that looks quite bad, but even within that row, the symptoms are not consistent from plant to plant to plant. When we see drift, we see much more consistency until that drift peters out as it goes across the field. But with herbicide residue, we kind of see all sizes and shapes of the injuries even within a row and from row to row. So it's a little uneven looking, and that's just a clue that that could very well be a herbicide residue issue. I've seen that before with some clopyralid residue carryover on soybeans. Haven't really heard very much about that this year, but what we really seem to be seeing is the flucarbazone residues on peas, and again, faba beans seems to be the big one this year. But with any type of residue, one of the clues is the inconsistency of symptoms from plant to plant and from row to row, and then going back and investigating exactly which herbicide last year is the culprit, and each herbicide has different parameters to be watching for. And again, that flucarbazone is the low pH, or sorry, the high pH and the low organic matter areas of the field. In a good year with lots of moisture, you might not see it nearly as much, but you might see a hint of it, because those parameters aren't going to change unless you're going to do some landscape restoration. But the biggest overriding factor for that one is the moisture, which we just didn't have last year.
I don't know if you could see me start grinning when you started talking about landscape restoration, Kim. So thanks for that plug, because I was thinking the exact same thing. If there is ever a year that would start to show those benefits from actually moving soil that's, you know, eroded down to the bottom of the hill and putting it back on the top again, this is one of those years that it really is showing that there would have been some benefit to having that topsoil back at the top of the hill, just to decrease a lot of those things. I know we've talked about seed place injury with fertilizer on those eroded knolls, you know, talking about things like the carryovers, stuff like that. It's definitely something that we're hoping that people will be more interested into the future. Kim, while we have you on, I've got another question that came in about, so at what seed moisture level is seed no longer filling and is appropriate then to apply a pre-harvest product?
Depending on the product. So normally you need to be, with glyphosate, that's our most restrictive, and I think it's 30% on glyphosate. Basically at that point, your seed has got the maximum water in it, and it's going to start shrinking down after that, because with glyphosate, we do not want glyphosate to get into our crop. We don't want residues. Glyphosate is systemic. If we spray it on our crops when they're too green, which I have seen again and again and again, it does get into the seed, which affects, we can find residues in there that shouldn't be there. That affects trade. But a big thing too is that affects the seed germination for next year. So especially on, you know, our cereals, if we're keeping some of those for seed for next year, that really affects them. When it's sprayed way too early, you can tell. I've worked at the elevator and seen that grain come in that got a pre-harvest spray way too early. So the pre-harvest sprays for glyphosate are actually quite a bit later than you think. You really need to take a look at the staging. There's a lot of good pictures. There's a lot of good resources from Bayer online, and we can make some available. This is something too that we can talk about, I think, in our upcoming crop talks that we have with Lionel on Wednesdays, where we can do a bit more of a presentation. But with glyphosate, that is the one that is the most restrictive. You need that crop to be, mostly like 30% moisture or less. And then if you start looking at heat, you actually, heat dries down a little bit quicker. And so then your crop needs to be a little bit further along than that, it needs to be a little bit more mature. And then if you're looking at reglone, you need to be a lot further along. You need to be reglone as a desiccant. Here we're going from pre-harvest. I mean, a glyphosate is a pre-harvest tool. Really, we're not looking at that as a crop dry down. We're looking at that for a weed management, especially our perennial or our biennial weeds. We're looking at that. We're not looking at that to dry down the crop because it's just too slow at that. But when you start talking about throwing in a desiccant like heat, or if you're going all the way to a true desiccant like reglone, your crop needs to be a lot more mature because it's going to dry down a lot quicker. So you need to have you need to be watching those stagings. But again, like we're normally at somewhere about that, say 30% and then down to 20% or ish for heat, and then less than 10% for the reg loan when then you're getting into true desiccation.
Excellent, thank you, Kim. So that's kind of it for questions that we've had come in. Does anybody else have a comment they want to make? Yeah, John, go ahead.
A question to Kim. My question is, given the dry conditions we have now, if a producer is applying a not a dry down, but a pre-harvest product, which like say glyphosate, which is really its main purpose is for weed control the following year, how effective is a glyphosate treatment would be done, not so much to dry down the crop, but to control potential perennial weeds like quackgrass, thistle, and so on, dandelions for next year? Because that's the main purpose really of glyphosate, right?
Yeah, no, that is right. I mean, it's really a weed management tool. It also can be used, though. I think we're going to see some pre-harvest go on just because we've had some late flushes of weeds, and we seem to be having a fair bit of annual weeds in our crops that are quite green and doing quite well despite the dry conditions. And I think we're going to maybe have some harvestability issues with some of these crops as the crops are drying down. But if there's a fair bit of weeds in there that are going to interfere with harvesting, I think we're going to see some glyphosate applications for that reason. I would say our weeds are, even though they are growing well, some of these weeds are growing really well, they are still hardened off because of the heat and the dry conditions. We've had a bit more humidity the last little bit, but those weeds have been growing in this heat. I would say use as much water as you can, depending on which product you use. If you're using adjuvants, use the maximum amount of adjuvant, but use lots of water. Use the maximum amount of water that's on the label. If we're doing glyphosate, there's no reason not to do 10 gallons. The days of 5 gallons with glyphosate are gone unless you've got a bad water source, which most people don't have. So if you've got good water, use 10 gallons, get lots of coverage. And with the other products, with the desiccants, we want you to use more and more water actually in order for them to work properly. But I do think we're going to see some pre-harvest management simply because of the amount of weeds that are coming in a fairly thin crop canopy sometimes. And yet these late rains have flushed these weeds because they weren't growing earlier in the year because we just didn't have the rain to get them going.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Sorry, I guess for next year though, like for the perennials, yeah, I guess they are still growing. It's just going to be, they are hardened off. I'm not sure. Well, I guess we'll have to see how well they take up the herbicide. I don't know. They will be hardened off. We may see them, finishing their life cycle a little bit earlier. Dandelions are hard to get at pre-harvest anyways, although this year we might have a better shot at it because the canopy is a little bit more open. The dandelions we're going after are the ones that are really right on the ground. They came from seed this year, like the big dandelions that went to seed first thing in the spring in May. Those ones are growing now, but they're not very big and they're flat on the ground and they're sometimes really hard to get. So a fall spray is usually a really good way if you've got a lot of dandelions and that seems to be a problem that's getting worse and worse. Then a fall spray actually is a really good time to get your dandelions. We don't always do a great job with pre-harvest on dandelions. It does some, but a fall spray is probably a better place to target that one. Hopefully we get a bit better conditions and a bit better growing conditions. And if our weeds are growing better, they take up the chemicals a lot better too. So we get better control.
Awesome, thanks, Kim. So that takes us to the end of our half hour. Just as a reminder, we will be posting this video to our YouTube page. Usually is posted last week. I was a little late getting it out, but should be posted sometime tomorrow. And it has links to the questions so that you can just pop in to re-listen to any of the single questions without having to go through the entire video if you don't want to. Also a reminder that Kim is actually going to be speaking tomorrow on Crop Talk about plants to watch for in sloughs and non-traditional hayland. So if you want to hear more about that, tune into Crop Talk tomorrow. And I'm sure a few of our panelists are also going to be posting or adding additional questions and things during the panel on Crop Talk tomorrow. So Kim just has one comment she wants to make. Go ahead.
Yeah, I brought a water hemp plants, actually more than one, but I found a new field with water hemp in it down in southern Manitoba. This is the time to be watching for that. I'm going to be talking about that, probably nothing, I'm going to be talking about nothing but that in the next couple of weeks as we start finding these fields that have water hemp, and hopefully we don't find any Palmer amaranths, but we are looking for both of those. So this is the time to be watching for that. I'll be talking about that in tomorrow's crop pest report that comes out by tomorrow afternoon. So I'll have some information on that, but this is the time to be watching. So if you have any suspicions, anything at all, give me a call, send me some pictures. I'll come out and take a look at it. We are sending samples away for DNA analysis so we know exactly what species we're dealing with, but I am 100% sure this is water hemp. So it's on the move, it's spreading, and we have more fields than ever. So please, please be watching for this, and stay tuned for more information in the next few weeks. Thanks very much, Marla.
Well, on that happy note,
Yeah.
we wrap up. Exactly. It's what a year, is all I can say. So, all right. Well, thanks again for everyone, for all of our panelists speaking this morning, for all of our attendees for bringing in your questions and listening intently this morning. And we will be back for our last installment of our Crop Diagnostic School Q&A sessions next week. So have a great week, and we will see you next Tuesday at 8:30. Bye, everybody.